I call Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I now understand why Trevor Mallard unusually invites his opponent to public meetings when he calls them. Because when we hear him talking about equating democratic socialism with Stalin, I mean, it only would suggest then that I should start talking about 1930s fascism and equating that to the National Party, which of course is a nonsense, because I wanted to start my speech on the Appropriations Bill tonight by acknowledging that Budget 2011-12 does include $5.5 billion for the rebuild of my city of Christchurch. And I do want to acknowledge that. That is 60% of the public cost of the infrastructure rebuild of my city. I think that any government would want to have done that, but it's important to acknowledge that, because nowhere will that money be spent more than in my electorate of Christchurch Central. Recently with other MPs, we had a tour of the CBD as in a core, the red zone, which I hadn't personally been into for some weeks, and it reminded me somewhat of the set of a science fiction movie. There was a very eerie feeling with 1,000 buildings to be demolished across that city centre, no noise taking place. And we had a reminder only yesterday morning at about 8:30 that we are not yet out of the woods in respect of aftershocks continuing in Christchurch. But I want to say that the defining piece of the budget for me and for Labor is the assertion that the government wants to go down the track of selling 49% of state assets, Meridian Energy, Genesis, Mighty River, Solid Energy and Air New Zealand. And I wanted to put on record my opposition to those sales and say this, that in the late 1990s, Telecom was sold by the government for the sum of $4.5 billion. It accrued in the period before it came back onto the share market and into New Zealand ownership in part, $14.5 billion in dividends and payments back to the owners. And that is a fundamental indication of the folly of selling state assets when they are making returns to the taxpayer in the hundreds and millions of dollars per annum. There is absolutely no logic other than some sort of market-driven ideology which says that is sound policy. I also wanted to raise again in this House, and I acknowledge that the National MP from Christchurch, Aaron Gilmore, is in the House tonight, and raise this question and ask for any member opposite to take a call at some point and deny this proposition. That in the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act is included provision which allows the forced sale if needs be, of Christchurch City Council assets and also those of the two other territorial authorities affected by the Canterbury quakes, Selwyn District Council, which owns substantial forestry assets, and the Waimakariri District Council. Now, I asked the Parliamentary Library to do me an analysis of what contribution one of those Christchurch City Council assets had made to the ratepayers of Christchurch. That asset is the Orion Power Network, which services most of Canterbury. Since 1993, the Orion Network has returned back to its majority shareholders, which is the Christchurch City Council, which owns 89.3%, some $875 million in dividends and other payments. In other words, nearly $1 million a week to the ratepayers of Christchurch, nearly $1 million a week. And I ask members opposite to stand up and tell my constituents there is no prospect of those assets being sold or part sold by a new term National Act government, because I think that is the agenda. And the reason I think it's the agenda is it's there in Budget 2011, because that outlines the philosophy which says it is absolutely acceptable to sell state assets, and the rationale is laid out in their budget. So if it's an appropriate rationale for the sale of state assets to reduce debt, I like, and I again ask Aaron Gilmore, sitting opposite, to take a call and deny that there is any prospect of Christchurch City Council assets, including Orion, including the majority stake in the port company, including the majority stake in the airport company, including the Enable broadband network, including the Redbus company and others. What is the position? I think the people of Christchurch deserve to know explicitly, because I think that what exactly is the scenario is there will be nothing before November the 26th on this front, but after there will be a coffin splitter and there'll be an announcement that we have to sell off Christchurch's assets to fund the debt generated, which I acknowledged at the start of the speech. The government has taken on responsibility for funding 60% of the build of the infrastructure in Christchurch. I acknowledge that. That's a responsible position. I acknowledge the government for taking account of the need to rebuild the infrastructure of Christchurch and meeting 60% of the costs. But I want to know, on behalf of the people I represent, whether the agenda is that will in part at least be funded by the sale of our assets, because we stood against the tide in the 1990s when other councils sold off their assets. We were the People's Republic of Christchurch, and proudly so. And across the political divide in Christchurch, people want to keep those assets because they know the contribution that they've made. I've given one indication of that, nearly $1 million a week. The very facility that was being used by Civil Defence and for a short time Sarah to start the recovery process was the Christchurch City Council gallery. A lot of that funding came out of those assets, such as Orion. So I would like Aaron Gilmore to take a call and give us an assertion, an assurance that this is not in prospect in a re-elected national government, because I think it's on the agenda, and if I wanted evidence of that, it's there in black and white in Budget 2011 with the outline of why this government believes asset sales are appropriate to reduce debt. I wanted to talk for a moment about the comments made by John Whitehead, the outgoing Treasury Secretary, on the Q&A the Sunday before last. I thought that Guy and Espiner gave him a good grilling on the job forecasts. 170,000 jobs forecast in this budget, 4% per annum growth forecast the year after next, and the comment back from John Whitehead was that Treasury has a second to none record for such predictions. Well, I asked the Parliamentary Library to analyse that. The Parliamentary Library tells me, in fact, that Treasury's growth forecasts have been wrong for 28 of the last 30 quarters. 28 of the last 30 quarters. In that interview, John Whitehead also confirmed that Treasury supported Michael Cullen in building the surpluses that were built through the time of the last Labor government, rather than giving tax cuts, because, as he said, these stood this country in good stead for the economic downturn that followed. So much for National's rhetoric about Labor's economic management. And then he talked about Treasury's concern about the growing inequality in New Zealand. Well, I have to say we are lagging at 26 out of 30 in the OECD, and we have to ask what's in this budget to address that inequality. What is in there? Are people going to be made better by asset sales? Are they going to be made better by KiwiSaver cuts? Are they going to be made better by the cuts in training, which I am astounded and appalled that in a budget which supposedly says we need to build skills, actually there's $90 million cut from training in this budget. I went with Phil Goff to the CPIT Trades Training Campus a couple of weeks back. CPIT gearing up to build its trades training facility there. But the point is, we will see about 1,000 extra trade trainees in Christchurch, and they are also going to be affected by that $90 million cut. We need tens of thousands more jobs in Christchurch. We have currently 10,500 people aged 15 to 24 on the Household Labour Force Survey estimate of unemployment. That's appallingly high. We need a plan. This budget does not contain one.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member.